Welcome to the Awakening to the Climate Crisis, a Buddhist Perspective. And we were just talking about this earlier, that to me, it's a good combination of being a climate activist and being a meditation facilitator, because there's a lot of fear and worry and anxiety that comes out when you talk about climate change and the impact that it's having. And I think being able to practice meditation and practice mindfulness can help us deal with that. Anyway, the purpose of my presentation is to look at the climate crisis from the perspective as a Buddhist. I believe some of you are practicing Buddhists or practicing meditation practitioners. I'll talk about some of the Buddhist teachings, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, and a couple of others. I'll talk about scientific facts of climate change, what Canada's doing about it, and what we can do and need to do, both personally and politically, to address it. And for those of you familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about engaged Buddhism. And my understanding of engaged Buddhism is to actually go out into the world, into your workplace, into your school, into your community, and practice Buddhism. So in that respect, I think we have a moral obligation to help address the suffering that's being caused by the climate crisis, and not just dealing with the results of the climate crisis, but trying to actually mitigate it and try to address it so that it doesn't get worse than it already is getting. So I'm hoping my talk is going to motivate you to take action. I believe that the climate crisis is the greatest crisis of our time. So outline of my presentation: I'll be doing a land acknowledgement, some housekeeping. My presentation will have a Q&A. And I think we mentioned earlier, maybe for those of you that just joined us, Denise, this is an interactive session. So Denise will be actually putting links in the chat as I talk about websites, as I talk about different organizations. She'll be putting the links into the chat. So those of you that are familiar with the chat, how to use chat, you can just click on the link. You can take a look at it if you like while I'm talking. I can make available a copy of my presentation with all the links in it after this event's over. So we'll have a Q&A. Sharon will be collecting questions and prompting you to ask any questions. She'll be collecting those, and we'll have a Q&A portion after the presentation part, and then we'll close out. So I'm hoping that my presentation will take about, let's see, I think I said about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes left for the Q&A portion. So I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'll just keep going. Oh, and you'll see in the chat, Denise will put a link that you can basically determine where you are in terms of which land you are residing on currently, and you can look it up with that website. Housekeeping: please respect each other and listen with an open mind. Please stay muted throughout the webcast unless we ask you to ask your question verbally. And there is actually subtitling available, so you can click on, let's see, I think in my case it's the More button, and you'll see something that says Show Subtitle, and therefore you'll start seeing words at the very bottom of the screen. Continuing on, we are monitoring the chat. If you have any problems or issues, just send a chat to Tech Denise or Tech Sharon, and they'll try to assist you. I already mentioned about sharing links, and about sharing a copy of the slides, and about the Q&A. So that's pretty much everything there. Okay, so some background about myself. Andre's already mentioned a couple things, but I'm Japanese Canadian. I'm a Sansei, third generation. I was born in Hamilton. I was a public servant. I worked in the Ontario government for about 28 years in information technology. I'm married. I have two daughters, Samantha and Camille, and two grandkids. So you can see Gibson here, he's 9, and Scarlett, well, she just turned 6. So I retired in 2011. In that same year, I was ordained into the Order of Interbeing, which was created by Thich Nhat Hanh. And he passed away a couple months ago now at the age of 95. During my retirement, I was president of the Hamilton Buddhist Temple for about 5 years, which is a different sect of Buddhism. And I guess the one thing, the third thing you can see in this slide is the United Nations IPCC report that came out in 2018. So when I read that, I became very concerned about the environment and climate change. And I was concerned from the extent that what kind of world will my children, my grandchildren be faced with? So I decided then to dedicate my retirement to doing everything I could to help address our climate crisis. So the truth, and this is talking about the Four Noble Truths, the truth is we are in a climate crisis. People all around the world are suffering from drought, heat waves, wildfires, food and water insecurity, and if you look at the articles in the paper, hurricanes, tropical storms. I think the first hurricane has just made groundfall, I think they call it, as a tropical storm. We are on track right now for, actually this is a bit of a misleading statement, but we are on track for a 1.8 degree temperature increase if all the promises that were made at COP26 in Glasgow can be met. But that is a big if. Currently, if we continue with business as usual, we're on track for about a 3 degree temperature increase. And right now, we're experiencing a 1.2 degree temperature increase. And we can see how, what's happening in terms of flooding, in terms of wildfires. Talk about the heat dome. Actually, I'll come to that. But we want to do everything that we can to keep our temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And here's what happened in Canada last year. We had the heat dome, and I think about 600 people died from heat in BC that summer. This was a graphic or a picture of the Lytton fire. I think they established a temperature record in Canada, and then the next day the whole town burnt down. This is Abbotsford, some of the flooding that took place in southern BC. And I just added this slide because of what happened in Ottawa last week. And this is just some of the things that people experienced in Ottawa. So this chart illustrates the carbon dioxide parts per million that we've been experiencing since, 1960. So the CO2 parts per million has been growing, and consequently, the temperature has been increasing. You'll notice that it's kind of a zigzag line. So in the wintertime, when there's no vegetation to absorb the CO2, the CO2 increases. But in the summertime, when the CO2, basically in the northern hemisphere, I know there's summer and winter, it reverses. But the bulk of the landmass is in the northern hemisphere. So when the vegetation comes out in summer, then the CO2 level actually drops. So you get this kind of a zigzag line but in spite of all the conferences of the parties that have been taking place, and we've had 26 of them, in spite of all of the international agreements, we still continue to see the CO2 levels grow. And if you go to co2.earth, this is in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, they report on the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth took place in 2006. It won 2 Academy Awards. It didn't change the situation at all. So, my next slide. All right. So Canada's record. Canada was the only one of the G7 countries whose GHG emissions actually went up by 21% since 1990. You can see this slide right here. We were worse than the United States, and this is while Donald Trump was the president. So Climate Tracker is an independent organization that looks at climate policies and actions of all countries in the world. They have rated Canada's climate policies and actions as highly insufficient. And you can go to that website and take a look at that. Here are some of the headlines concerning the climate crisis. We've had urgent messages from religious leaders, from the United Nations. They've called it Code Red for the Humanity. And continuing on, when this declaration came out, it made headlines in most other parts of the world. You see some of the headlines right here. In Canada, not so much. I think it was second page in the Globe and Mail, and I think it was on the front page of the Toronto Star, but maybe a couple of paragraphs. The scientists talk about untold suffering that we're faced with. The Lancet came out and said that it should be. They declared it code red for a healthy future. So it's some of the things that came out in the press, which brings us to the truth of the cause of our climate crisis. And just continuing here. Right. So here I want to talk about the three poisons. And this is a teaching from Buddhism. So ignorance. So I think for the most part, we're not really aware of how dire our situation is. We continue to burn fossil fuels and produce methane from other sources, including agriculture, food waste. We continue to harm nature, and the people least responsible are bearing the brunt of our climate crisis. So we talk about the global south, we talk about island communities, we talk about people that probably contribute the least to causing the carbon emissions, but are suffering the most. The next poison is attachment, overconsumption. So I believe that a lot of the problems behind climate change is because we overconsume. We waste. We don't want to change the way that we live. We buy what we want and not what we need. The third poison is aversion. So a lot of people are just ignoring the climate crisis. They're not concerned about it. They're hoping that someone else will deal with it. Some people think that they can't do anything about it, and some people have just given up hope. So those are all things that are not helping our situation. And that brings me to the truth of the end of our climate crisis. We actually know what needs to be done. Scientists, NGOs, they all have come up with different plans, the necessary actions that we need to take in order to prevent the climate crisis or reduce the serious impacts of the climate crisis. It's actually the political will that is the big part of the problem. But I wanted to show you this video at this point, so let me just stop my share here. Okay.
The critical question is, what does the future hold and what do we need to do now? The IPCC makes it very clear that if we follow the current set of global climate mitigation policies, then our kids and grandkids will see an average global surface temperature increase of about 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That would mean more than 1 million species of animals and plants going extinct on land and in our oceans towards the end of the century, and more than 1 billion human climate refugees attempting to migrate from uninhabitable areas to somewhere they can actually survive, which may well lead to regional and international conflicts as 10 or 11 billion human beings all fight over a rapidly decreasing amount of livable space and an increasingly limited supply of edible food and drinkable water. To give ourselves a greater than 50% chance of avoiding that nightmare and limiting warming to the safe level of just 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, then global greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, will have to reach their peak no later than 2025, say the IPCC. So that's less than 3 years from now. And the International Energy Agency just told us that global CO2 emissions went up by another 6% in 2021 as we all bounced back from COVID. So our trend line's not looking too encouraging right now. By 2030, less than 8 years from now, the world needs to achieve a 48% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions compared to 2019 levels to stay on target for 1.5 degrees of warming. By 2040, we're looking at an 80% decrease in CO2 to stay on the 1.5 degrees pathway, by which time we'll also need to have reduced methane emissions by 44% compared to 2019 levels. Is this looking challenging to you? Because it is to me. The slightly better news, according to the IPCC, is that there's a range of tangible actions we can take to stop the runaway freight train. They set out all these so-called mitigation options in a single chart, focused on what can actually be achieved by or before 2030. As well as the ability to be rapidly implemented this decade, the two other criteria that the IPCC apply are, number one, how big an impact will it have on the problem, and number two, how much will it cost?
So we have the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is the path that leads to the end of our climate crisis. So this is the wheel of the Dharma, which also embodies the Noble Eightfold Path. And I'm going to start with right mindfulness. So let me get to that. Okay. As I said, we know what to do. And as Just Have a Think talked about, the International Energy Agency has laid out a pathway to net zero. There's also other scientists that have produced documents, and there's a book called Drawdown, written by Paul Hawken, and it provides 100 solutions to our climate crisis. And as I mentioned, there's other think tanks and environmental organizations in Canada and outside Canada that have developed climate action plans that governments and corporations can follow. And continuing, the IPCC came out with this Climate Change 2022 Mitigation of Climate Change. The full report's 2,913 pages, but they have a summary of 64 pages. But again, they lay out what the plan that we need to follow in order to reduce the effects of the climate change. So it's just having and I mentioned this earlier, having the political will to do these things. I think for me, mainstream media coverage is part of the problem. They don't report on the breadth and depth of climate disasters. Like, there are disasters taking place all over the world, but it very rarely gets reported. And if at all, it's only a couple paragraphs in your newspaper. So there's a website called Watcher's Website that talks about all of the extreme weather events that are taking place. The thing about mainstream media coverage, sure, they'll talk about the flood, they'll talk about the Ottawa storm, but they don't connect the dots. They don't say that the reason these disasters are taking place is because Canada continues to subsidize, extract, and burn fossil fuels and produce methane. Methane comes from leaking gas wells and from agriculture. So when I say they don't connect the dots, sure, they talk about the disaster, but they don't say, and this is because we are continuing to burn fossil fuels. And even if in Alberta we're producing fossil fuels, they get shipped off elsewhere and they get burned there. But it's all the same atmosphere. So, and I think possibly one of the reasons for why they don't connect the dots very much in the media is that they advertise for oil and gas companies. If you want to buy gasoline, if you want to buy a car, if you want to travel, airlines, they're all advertising on TV. So I think it's not so much on the websites or I guess not so much on the websites on the internet, but in mainstream media, like I'm talking about the newspapers, I'm talking about TV, like CBC TV or CTV. They very rarely connect the dots, the reasons behind it. So there are some media that actually are reporting more openly and honestly about our climate crisis, and I just wanted to show you those ones. Right. So these are some of the, I guess you would call them internet media sites. Canada's National Observer is a good one. The Guardian in the UK, I've indicated where they're from the United Kingdom, but I think all these other ones are within Canada. There are websites that specifically talk about climate. There's an energy mix that's written by Mitchell Beer in Ottawa, and the Carbon Brief is a similar one that's from the UK. Even BBC does better reporting on climate change. So I actually subscribe, and the reason how these websites, news media survive is from donations and sponsorship and getting subscribers. So I subscribe to Canada's National Observer and The Guardian, and that's why they're able to. They don't have any advertising, so you might want to take a look at those. In particular, the energy mix is basically for Canada, but you might want to take a look at that if you get a chance. So right mindfulness, continuing with right mindfulness, you can sign up for climate newsletters, and CBC. In fact, I think most of the CBC, I think Globe and Mail has one now. I think CTV has it as well. So you can sign up for these different climate newsletters from various organizations. So next I'm going to talk about right concentration and right view. So right concentration and right view. For those of you that are practicing in the Plum Village tradition, this should look familiar. So mindfulness, concentration, and insight. So practicing right mindfulness, you would take all this information in from reputable sources, then you move to right concentration. And if we focus and concentrate on understanding what is causing the climate crisis, we can arrive at what needs to be done. So what is our right view? So our right view is that the climate crisis is affecting the entire world. It's going to get worse. Canada's not doing enough. Canada is treating the COVID-19 pandemic like an emergency. Like we had all kinds of different programs to help people survive. But so we know that they can actually do something if they put their mind to it about our climate crisis. And as has been mentioned, we need to have urgent and drastic action now. So right thinking, it's understanding all of these things, and I'm not going to go through them. Some of them are pretty clear. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop drilling and extracting fossil fuels. We need to electrify everything, basically, our transportation, our home heating. And practicing sustainable agriculture has gotten a lot of write-up lately. So and a lot of this is related to injustice. So indigenous injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice, because, I think basically we talk about mining in South America or in Africa. So indigenous peoples live on these lands, but they're driven off those lands so companies can come in and extract minerals and chop down forests. So that's some of the injustices that are happening right now. And even here in Canada, we talk about the Wet'suwet'en and the Coastal GasLink that they're trying to build. So next comes right speech and another video. So let me stop my share here and go to that video. And she's actually a climate scientist. She's actually comes from Toronto, but she's probably one of the most well-known speakers on climate change in the United States. Here, I'll let her speak.
How do I talk about climate change to my brother-in-law, my neighbor, my colleague, my coworker? I hear this question almost every single day. And usually people have given it a try and it hasn't gone so well. It's either ended in an argument or it's been so depressing you just want to go back to bed and pull the covers back over your head. Here's the thing. Climate change is scary. And it absolutely is depressing. I'm a climate scientist, so I know. But to care about climate change, we don't have to be a certain type of person. I'm absolutely convinced that just about every single person has every reason they need to care about climate change already. And their reason might be different than yours or mine. But if we don't think we care about climate change, it's not because we have to change who we are or what we care about. It's simply because we have not connected the dots between what we already care about and how climate change is affecting it. So when we have these conversations starting over something that we share, whether it's a love of cooking or a sport or the place where we live or our child, we connect the dots between climate change and how it's affecting what we already care about, what already matters to us. And then we talk about how we really can fix this thing. And in fact, climate change is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of a very steep hill with only a few hands on it. That giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. It just needs more hands to get it going faster. When we realize that we are not alone, when we realize that the world truly can change, that's when we realize that yes, we truly can make a difference. And how do we knock over that first domino? By having a simple conversation about why climate change matters and what we can all do to help fix it.
So we actually had her at I think it was our World Environment Day, I think it was. She came to speak. She actually has spoken just recently in the past couple months here in Toronto as well. So she's a very popular speaker. She was actually designated one of the United Nations Champions of the Earth So there's a number of programs that I just want to make you aware of. Kitchen Table Climate Conversations. And this is a program that helps to teach you how you can carry out a climate conversation with a family member or friends. So it's actually a very very popular program. So you can go to that website, and actually they will support people in having conversations with family and friends, and actually organizing a webcast if that's what you'd like to do as well. Carbon Conversations Toronto, it's a program that came over to us from United Kingdom, and it is actually, when I took it, it was a 6-week in-person program, 1 day a week or 1 evening a week, and again it would talk about how you can have a conversation about climate change. So you might want to look into those. And personal action. So there's things that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. Some obvious things: if you eat less meat, if you bike more, take public transit more, drive less, perhaps drive a electric vehicle if you can. So these are some of the websites that you can go to that talk to you about how you can reduce your carbon footprint. And there's this other video that was from Just Have a Think, which is a very good video. I recommend watching that if you have the time. And basically, buying less. I think I already mentioned earlier, buy what you need, not what you want. And what else do we have here? I think that's it for that slide. Okay, so again, this is actually talking about banking and investments. So the report, actually there was a new report that just came out. I should update this slide, but this is produced by the Rainforest Action Network, and it's a report on how much investment in fossil fuels banks across the world are doing. And as it turns out, 3 Canadian banks are in the top 12. I don't know if you can make it out very clear, but the ones that are missing, TD invested $121 billion, Scotiabank $114 billion, Bank of Montreal invested $97 billion, CIBC $67 billion. So they're our banks are some of the biggest investors in fossil fuels in the world. There is a program that was started up by Climate Pledge Collective called Bank Switch, and they actually talk to you about how you can switch switch from a big 5 bank to perhaps a credit union instead. So they walk you through what the process could be, would look like. And if you are paying into Canada Pension Plan or any of the, I think it's big 4, big 5 pension plans. So if you're a healthcare worker, if you're a public municipal employee, if you go to this website, you can actually send a message to the people that run your pension fund and ask them to divest from fossil fuels. So you can look at that, look at those links in the chat. It's called Shift Action. And right, social action. So one of the things I suggest to people, if they want to, is to actually do something about it and volunteer. So there's a lot of organizations you can volunteer with, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be environmental organizations. Any social justice organizations, Fight for 15, I think was one of the ones that comes to mind, $15 minimum wage. So there's the national organizations that I listed here. There's some local Toronto ones if you're in Toronto, and I'm trying to remember what the Ottawa ones were, but I'm pretty sure there's a couple of Ottawa ones as well. But volunteer. Help make a difference, either by informing people about the climate crisis or encouraging them to get involved. Just continuing on, right political action. So Canada has made a commitment at the last COP26 that they will have a 40% GHG reduction by 2030. They just released their emissions reduction plan. So what does a 40% reduction mean? So it actually means that 40% of our cars, buses, trains need to be converted to electric vehicles. It also means that 40% of our houses, our office buildings, our public buildings need to be off natural gas. So that is a huge change. So in order to make that happen, we need to tell government that this, this has to be done. This is the drastic action that we're talking about. And electrifying things isn't enough if the electricity that we're using is being generated from fossil fuels. And in the case of Alberta, I've listed them here: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and Nunavut, they're still burning fossil fuels to produce their electricity. So what do we want to tell our elected representatives to do? So there is a current campaign I'm involved with, which is called Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. They set out 12 different points as to what needs to be done in order to address our climate crisis. This is another video that it's actually my favorite video, so let me stop the share on this. This talks about reducing fossil fuel subsidies, and it's actually produced by the United Nations.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
And if you go to their website, they actually counter every excuse that anyone could make about climate change with a response. So it's quite good. So currently, Environmental Defense, which is an NGO based in Toronto, they calculate that the federal government is spending about $3.3 billion in subsidies annually to the fossil fuel industry. So it's a lot of money, which could be invested in solar farms and wind turbines. So, right political action. You can actually ask your local government to declare a climate emergency. I've noted a couple of them here. Vancouver was the first one, and Toronto declared it in 2019. Actually, Climate Fest was involved in making that happen. I don't know where Ottawa is. I don't recall them having done that yet, but maybe we can look into that. There's also something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically these three things: prevent proliferation of fossil fuels, phase out existing fossil fuel production, and then a just transition to fast track people in particular in the fossil fuel industry into renewable energy instead, or some alternative employment. So This was actually supported by the Dalai Lama and Fridays for Future. And so the action is to actually endorse this treaty. And actually, Toronto endorsed it in 2021. Vancouver was the first city in Canada to do it in 2020. And there's been other parts of Vancouver that have done the same thing. But maybe something that Ottawa can look into as well. So continuing on, political action. You can write to your city councillor, your MPP or MP, that's basically the 3 levels of government, to take action. You can do what we call deputations to your city council. We've done that in Toronto. You can write letters to the editor. And actually, if you go to the Climate Fast website, they can provide more information about taking these types of actions. So, and I put this up here, but I think it's too small to read. I've actually had 2 letters published so far in the Toronto Star, and that was my last one in April. You can sign a petition. If you go to these websites, they have petitions on taking action with regard to climate change. You can also create your own petition, and almost to the end. So write political action. So as you should know, there's an election on June 2nd, which is this coming Thursday. And there's several campaigns that are running right now. Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign is one of them that I'm involved with. Actually, so is Sharon. And Not One Seat is another one that I'm involved with, along with Sharon as well. And I'll show you the links when we come to the next page, the next slide. There's the Ontario Voters Coalition, which I think was involved in canvassing voters to pay more attention to climate change. And GreenPAC was actually organizing debates in various ridings in Toronto around getting the candidates to come together and talk about climate change as well as other issues. For our kids, I just discovered this website. It's a great website with regard to the election and other important information. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. And yeah, so this is what I was talking about. And it's kind of a small print, but basically, if you click on the link here, so what it is basically trying to operationalize strategic voting and make it very easy to do. So Not One Seat, their goal is to flip the 11 progressive conservative ridings over to either a Liberal, NDP, or a Green Party. And basically what they're doing is analyzing who is the next best candidate to displace the progressive conservative candidate. So if you go to the website, there's candidates that they've endorsed, and those are the people that we're recommending that you vote for. Because basically what's been happening is that you have the progressive votes being split between the Liberals, the NDP, and the Green Party. And because of that, Conservatives have enough votes so that they actually win the seat. But the idea then is to make sure that one of the best candidate of those 3 parties, the best progressive candidate, is the one that gets all the voting, so that they can actually overturn the PC candidate. So that's the thinking behind Not One Seat. Not One Seat only addresses the ridings in Toronto, but for ridings outside of Toronto, there's another website, another organization that's actually looking at the candidates in all the other ridings in Ontario, including Toronto actually. But if you go to that website and you put in your postal code, they'll tell you who is the candidate that you should vote for strategically to overturn the PC candidate, whether that he's an incumbent or he or she is an incumbent. You can show your support for the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. The link here will actually send an action letter to the candidates in your riding based on your postal code, and to the 4 political leaders, and tell them that they need to get serious about climate change and do something about it. So that's what you can do with that particular link. And right livelihood, I put this in here just to cover off livelihood. If you're doing something that's contributing to the suffering of others, look for alternative work. The one organization I wanted to mention was Iron and Earth. We actually had a speaker from Iron and Earth, but they're basically oil patch workers that realize that they need to be working in the renewable energy and making that transition. So that's what that organization is doing. And which brings us to the last spoke in the wheel of the Dharma, and that is right diligence. So start or continue to do those things that help to address our climate crisis. Do not lose hope, and that's where the meditation aspect, the mindfulness aspect comes in. Don't give in to the worry, the fear, or the anxiety that climate change could very easily generate. In fact, they talk about eco-anxiety now, especially in our young people. So any action you can take, no matter how small, makes a difference. Remember the second I of Buddhism, impermanence. The first I was interconnectedness. And there is a theory, and I think it's been proven, that it only takes 3.5% of a population to make change happen. It's called the 3.5% rule. It comes from Erica Chenoweth. You can take a look at that website. And so what is a Buddhist in closing? So be wise, stay informed, read different media, the internet media links that I talked about. Keep learning, watch out for false solutions. I'm thinking of carbon capture, I'm thinking of small, we call them SMRs, small modular reactors. They may be great technology, but none of it's been proven, and none of it's going to be scalable. In fact, they talk about some of it perhaps being ready by 2030. It's going to be too late. So be compassionate in your conversations, your climate conversations and your advocacy, but use your time and energy where you think it will have the greatest impact. So I think every individual has different skills, different experiences, differences, and just think of where you can best contribute, whether it's in volunteering in an environmental organization or some sort of welfare organization or social justice organization. So just think about that. And if we want to have a livable future, then we need to do everything we can to address this crisis. And I'll close with this final quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, that we have the power to decide the destiny of our planet. And that's it. So if you have any questions, hopefully you've been putting them into the chat, because we'll get into the Q&A portion. And a little bit longer than what I had hoped for, but I think we started a little bit late. You can email me if you have any questions that don't get answered. And the organization I belong to, I've been there for about 3 years now, climatefast.ca. And my website, myclimatechange.home blog, I actually post articles on climate change and Indigenous issues in the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail. I'll post them to my website daily, on a daily basis. And I think that's it. So I'll stop my share and we'll go into the Q&A. So Sharon.
Yeah, hello everybody. You could still be posting questions in the chat, incidentally, because I've gotten a couple, but not a whole lot. So let me ask the first one, which is a bit of a clarification question. Ray, you mentioned investment dollars in oil and gas that are being made and that could be reduced, reallocated. Were those annual figures that you were referring to?
They were spread over a period of time. So I think it was a cumulative investment.
It was cumulative? Okay, yeah. Great.
Yeah. I think it was 2016 to 2020, I think.
Okay. And is that in the slide deck so people would be able to take
it's in the slide deck.
Good. All right, that's excellent. I guess this is a tough nut to crack here, but another question that came up was, okay, so transportation is a big issue in Canada and especially in maybe urban centers. Transportation, greenhouse gas reduction is sort of relying on electrification, and particular electric cars. So can you comment on the mining of rare elements for electric vehicles? Have you got some kind of perspective on that would be helpful?
Well, I think China's actually been going around buying up all the rare earth elements. I know they've talked about developing the Ring of Fire up north. I think if they can do it with indigenous agreement, then it's fine. But we tend to plow ahead doing things and not asking for that, what do they call it, informed consent. There's a couple other adjectives to describe.
Prior and informed.
Prior and informed consent, something like that, yeah. So yeah, so the rare metals are going to be important to electrification. But I know one of the things that is a concern is that right now the Doug Ford government is planning to shut down the Pickering nuclear station and replace it with 3 gas-powered generating stations, which are going to increase our GHG emissions by, I think the numbers are 300 or 400%. Because one of the best things that was done was that we shut down our coal-fired electrical generating stations. So that decreased our carbon emissions by an enormous amount. But now it sounds like we're going to be taking this backward step by starting to use natural gas-fired electrical generating stations. So that's going to be a problem.
And I think, Ray, if I'm correct about this, but you can sort of clarify, it's that the proposal is to use gas instead of investing in renewables like
energy.
wind and
right. Yeah, I don't know if I have the link for the Ontario Clean Air Coalition. I can't remember, Denise, if we have that link, but that organization has been doing the most around ensuring our electricity stays clean. And actually, I think they're not pro-nuclear either. So, but I think what's been missing, and even in Canada's latest emissions reduction plan, there's very little investment, if any at all, in solar farms or wind turbines, geothermal. Like those 3 things in southern Alberta and I think even southern British Columbia. Like those are ideal areas that are suited for that type of electricity generation, and yet the federal government doesn't invest in that. So I can't understand why that's the case.
So would it be fair to say, Ray, that those are the kinds of things that people can sort of get a beat on and write their politicians?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm going to be presenting to the Calgary Buddhist Temple this coming Sunday. But that whole area, apparently they're the best area in Canada for solar farms and for wind turbines. So I'll be talking about that. Yeah.
So another question, which is near and dear to my heart actually, is so what does declaring a climate emergency entail, asks Andre. Is it just a statement or does it have consequences? And his context is that the Ottawa mayor refused to say that Ottawa was in a state of emergency because of the storm, because doing so would have no effect. So what's your perspective on that, Ray?
Declaring a climate emergency? It's
Well, what does it, what do you think it means, or what should it mean, whatever?
What should it mean? It should mean that your government, your elected leaders are taking climate change seriously. Canada declared a national emergency in 2019. Vancouver, as I mentioned, was the first city to declare a climate emergency. So, because you've declared that climate emergency, you have to follow that up with action, right? Which means you have to follow up with dollars to support that action. So when City of Toronto declared a climate emergency, they put together their first, the net zero by 2040 plan. But the one thing that we're concerned with now is making sure that they have sufficient budget to actually make that plan happen. But it's kind of like I guess you declare the climate emergency first and then you start following up with action. But it gets people thinking that the government is taking this seriously when they declare an emergency, and therefore we're going to start looking at what's your plan for getting us there, and then what's the funding for making it happen. So I think it's just an important first step if you can do that. So Sharon?
Well, I had one question that's been puzzling me, so if you don't mind, Ray, I'll just put it in the
Sure.
hopper here. I've been noticing that because of the conflict in Ukraine, oil and gas prices have risen dramatically,
Right.
and there's been a call for government to subsidize.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, one of the benefits of the Ukraine war, which I can't see too many of, is that it is jacking up the price of oil and gas, and therefore it's probably accomplishing what would have taken years for the carbon price to do.
Right.
But the real issue is, okay, but what about the people for whom, this is just a huge economic blow? Like they can't survive.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any thoughts or have you read anything that would suggest how the government, how the carbon price or this rise in oil is going to be dealt with equitably.
Hmm. So I know in the UK they're talking about a windfall tax that would apply to fossil fuel companies because they're making so much money because of the increase in price, in the price of gasoline, natural gas, and so forth. So I think that's something that we should really be looking at. But I know that it's in the northern communities, like the only way they can generate their electricity is from burning diesel. So I think in those cases you have to probably going to have to subsidize that kind of situation. So, but I agree with you, Sharon, that I think the rising price of natural gas and gasoline is actually helping people. Instead of putting off buying an EV if they can afford one, like to next year, they want to buy it now because gasoline prices are so high, which is the whole concept behind the carbon tax or carbon levy, as some people call it. So, and I know the levy is supposed to increase every year. We're supposed to increase it by a certain percentage, and this has just kind of accelerated the whole process. So, but hopefully people will take public transit more. People will convert to getting an EV instead, and people will press government to start to electrify. Because if you think about it, if your buses and trains are running on fossil fuels, it's going to cost you a lot more to actually ride those vehicles unless they make that transition to electrified a vehicle. And I know that City of Toronto, I think they just recently purchased some hydrogen fuel cell buses, I think, if I remember correctly. So I think cities, municipalities are realizing they need to start making this transition. And I think the war in the Ukraine is actually just accelerating that whole process. Anything else, Sharon?
Yeah, there's a question from Amila, or Amita, sorry. What's your opinion on flying and air travel, she asks.
Okay, so air travel is probably the most carbon intensive thing that you can do. So if anything, reducing, I guess, first of all, not flying at all, but I know the thing about Canada, like if you want to go see your relative in Vancouver, I've got 2 sisters in Vancouver. If I want to drive, it's going to take me about 4 days to get there. So I think it's just being aware that this is a carbon intensive mode of travel. And if you can somehow maximize when you're out there, reduce the number of times you're traveling by air. And people talk about carbon offsets, like buying carbon offsets, but I think you're just kind of making an excuse for why you want to do these things, right? So if you travel locally within Canada, it's going to be a lot better in terms of carbon emissions if instead of traveling to Europe or traveling wherever else you might want to go in the world. But it's something to be aware of and conscious of, and try to reduce it as much as you can.
Yeah, I guess Tracy's asking, are trains
trains
better? And I think there are charts that will tell you, under a certain distance, it's better to drive, although trains are likely to be better, but it depends if they're full or not full.
Right.
And so there's a lot of subtlety to it, but
but talking about airlines, you may have heard about these ghost flights where they'll fly empty planes into airports just so that they can keep their landing privileges in that airport. Like, it's crazy. But that's what they do. They'll take an empty plane because they want to keep the landing privilege open in that airport. And if they don't use it, I guess they lose priority in getting that landing spot in the airport. But I don't think I have a link for that, but I think they're called ghost flights. So
actually, Ray, maybe if we can find a link to something that does show, where the different modes of transportation make the most sense, that might be helpful to send out to people later.
Yeah, okay. I'll look for that.
The Carbon Footprint of Everything is quite a good book that ranks all the different activities, like even online banking has a carbon footprint, and and answers it used to be called what is the cost of a banana, or what is the carbon footprint of a banana, or something.
Yeah. I've seen the book actually. I kind of went through it very quickly, but yeah, it has the GHG emissions for anything you might want to do or anything you might want to buy or eat, for that matter. So, but I'll put that. Yeah.
Well, that's a great reference.
Yeah.
So, if anybody has any other questions, this would be the moment.
We can go to gallery view. How's that? Any questions? Andre, you have your hand up?
Sorry, yes, I do have my hand up. So there's a documentary that you've probably seen, and maybe others have too, about Thich Nhat Hanh's life that was just recently released on YouTube. It's called The Cloud Never Dies. And at the very end, I don't want to play the clip right now, but at the very end there's a kind of invocation by Thich Nhat Hanh that we're in the situation that we're in. We need spiritual transformation. We need to transform ourselves, and that we need to see that our planet and ourselves are not separate. I mean, it's obvious, but it's also just an idea, right? It's like the food that we eat comes from the earth, and if the earth is, if we can't grow food, we're not going to be able to eat. Like, it's obvious, right? But knowing, like, really knowing this connection, really understanding the interbeing between our own life and our lives, the lives of our children and our descendants, and caring for the planet. This is what I think. Many things we need to do, like in terms of action, but in terms of the spiritual transformation that needs to take place, that's a really, making that connection is really important, I think. And so my question is, I mean, it's to anybody, is like, how best to do that? I mean, I often feel myself this disconnect between, me and nature, and it's like, what can we do to reinforce this?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. I think what it's kind of leading us to is that we need to live more simply, like live with less things, less stuff. I think there was a video called Stuff, but I think that's part of it. Yeah, Sharon, you had a point to raise or comment?
Yeah, I have a thought about the question that you raised, Andre, and particularly the food question. I remember going to the 2013 retreat in St. Catharines where Thich Nhat Hanh was actually present. And at the table, which for lunches and whatever, there was a piece of paper or a little thing that you sort of read through or recited. And I've always felt that makes that connection. And so if you were to actually spend that few minutes before you start eating, I think
and you're talking about the 5 contemplations. Yeah.
Right.
So, and that is
that not correct, or am I missing?
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That's the usual practice, is to read that before each meal at a retreat in the Plum Village tradition. So, but just to come back to what Andre was saying though. So there are countries, there are whole regions right now that are running out of water. Like, they can't grow enough food. So you probably read about some of them, some of it in the newspapers. But there are people that are suffering the effects of climate change right now. Like, you talk about Johannesburg, I think they were like zero water available in that entire city. So the crisis is already happening. It's just that it hasn't come here yet. And those people that are in, you look at Pakistan and India, the heat wave that they're going through right now, like it's 40 plus degrees right now. They can't go outside because it's too hot. So where are they going to go? They're going to go north and south. And most of the landmass on Earth is in the northern hemisphere. They're going to be coming to Canada, to Russia, places that have more land, and areas that are at least habitable. You can live there. It might be too cold because of the winter, but at least you have enough water. You can grow food. So, any questions? Yes, Tracy.
Gosh, this was such a good way to spend time together. I'm really grateful for the invitation and your just like action-packed, jam-packed presentation.
Thanks.
I've been meditating with the Thich Nhat Hanh folks here in Ottawa, not for too long, like maybe 6 months. I identify as a meditator, not as a Buddhist. But truth is truth. And I don't quite understand the context. I don't know what the history is. Maybe Andre or someone else on the call can enlighten us a little bit more. But there's been an agitation, and I'm sensing a polarity in this need for right action as a practitioner. And we've had some really juicy, fiery, soulful conversations about our responsibility as practitioners to be paying attention to the climate emergency and the climate crisis. And what does that look like in our own practice? What does that look like in community? And I'm not sure, but I think there's a tension and a struggle in the Ottawa community about that. You know, how much is enough? Is that the call that we're to heed? I sense there's some kind of tension between action and inaction. I don't know where it comes from. I'm just sensing it. I've noticed it in our conversations. Could you just say a little bit more about your own practice and your own sort of value stance on the responsibility of a spiritual practitioner to be making these connections in our own lives, but also in our spiritual communities?
Okay. So when I retired in 2011, I basically dedicated myself to dealing with climate change and informing people, family, friends, associates of the climate crisis. And I just continue to do that. I think it's up to each individual as to what they want to do, what they see as their role. You can't force anyone to do something they don't want to do, right? But for me, and I come back to the term that Thich Nhat Hanh uses, engaged Buddhism. You know, it's fine to have the wisdom. We can only demonstrate our compassion by actually going out into the world, seeing the suffering, and trying to deal with it. Like one of the questions I always ask my Sangha is, you know, why are we here? What are we meant to do? We're here to create joy and happiness for ourselves and for others. We're here to reduce the suffering in ourselves and reduce the suffering of others, right? And the climate crisis is causing a lot of suffering right now. So again, it's up to the individual as to what they see themselves wanting to do or desiring to do. You can't force anyone to do anything they don't want to. So I find it, when you say tension, like, is it people trying to force people to do something that they don't want to do? I don't know. Maybe it is. I'm not familiar with the Ottawa situation. But for me, I try to inform people as much as I can about things that they're not aware of. And unless you're following like some of these websites that I talked about, you don't hear half the problems that are happening in the world, right? So I think it's just important to become aware, make yourself aware by different news sources and media and internet, and then do whatever you can about it. So, because I think about Gibson and Scarlett, like they're 9 and 6, right? 20 years from now, what kind of world are they going to be living in, right? If we continue on the track that we're on, 3-degree temperature increase, 4-degree temperature increase, very possible, unless we take drastic and urgent action. And I wouldn't want them to try to live in a world like that, because what will happen? Scarcity of water, scarcity of food, scarcity of even someplace where you can actually live. People, you're going to have billions of people that are having to migrate because they can't live where they are right now. And then what's going to happen to the rest of us? So, and the only thing that saves us right now, because we're pretty fortunate, you know, to be honest, living in Canada. Like we're considered one of the wealthiest countries. Like, you know, we talk about Ottawa being best city to live in. You know, we're fortunate that we're in Canada right now. We're not seeing half of what's going on in the world. But if you're in Africa, or you're in South America, you're in anywhere around the equatorial belt, you can already see the problems that people are having, and how are they going to survive? And that's where our compassion and our wisdom that we hopefully have can make a difference. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Tracy. Questions, comments? Otherwise, we're going to, I think, wrap up. But certainly, anyone else would like to say something?
I'd like to say something, if I may, just to follow up on Tracy's comment and question. I mean, I think, I don't know what the answer is. And I do think that we have individual responsibilities and we have collective responsibilities in our workplace, in our interactions with other people. I just want to repeat or reiterate Tracy's question, because I think it's a very important one. Is like, how do we develop, or maybe rephrase it? How do we develop a collective Sangha change in consciousness that leads us to bring about change? And I don't know what the answer is to that question. I think certainly one element of it is practicing together, and certainly the pandemic hasn't been very helpful in that regard. But having a sense of the value of each other's lives, as in how we depend on each other, is I think one way of developing a collective consciousness about what matters to us collectively, and how to nurture that. I don't really have an answer, but I think we definitely need to do that, and the earth as well, of course.
I think it's easier for people to coalesce around an action if you decide to take an action and people can support that action. So, and I'll come back to what Climate Fast did. Like we actually one of the strengths of Climate Fast is that we have good interaction with our city councilors, and there's several city councilors. Mike Layton, who was the son of Jack Layton, who passed away, NDP leader. He is one of our great supporters on Toronto City Council. But him, Shelley Carroll was another one. There's a couple of the councillors. You need to engage with these people. You need to talk about how concerned you are, and if you can have them put forward a motion to declare a climate emergency, to endorse the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, to bring in a climate action plan that actually helps deal with climate change. Like those are the things that are important in terms of your kids, your grandkids, if you have them. Like otherwise, if we keep going along what we call BAU, business as usual, we're going to end up 3 degrees, 4 degrees is not out of the question. Like it could still happen, and it will happen unless we want to change that. So. And that's my impetus. I keep thinking about my grandkids, that what I'm doing right now is for them, really, and for everyone else's grandkids too. So, Sharon.
Yeah, I think that kind of brings us around to Catherine Hayhoe and her point about talking to people about the climate, but beginning with what matters to them. And I think that really is one of the most powerful things to do, is to, in a compassionate way, to make those connections for people. So, but it's tough to do.
So I think we should probably wrap up unless someone else has a last sharing they'd like to do. But I think Denise put my email ID in the chat, I think. So if you have any questions or you want to send me a comment or anything else afterwards, please feel free to do that. It's all part of what I see my role as, just making people aware, informing them where I can. And if you want to say to me, Ray, how would I go about asking my city council to declare a climate emergency? Just let me know. We've got a lot of resources in Climate Fast and other organizations. I know people in Greenpeace, people in For Our Kids. So there's different organizations that have some of that expertise that Climate Fast may not have. But I know our Kitchen Table Climate Conversations, how to talk with people about climate change. We've been doing that program for about probably at least a half a year now, I think. So maybe we'll just wrap up.
I did want to say, like, I've seen a lot of gratitude comments on the chat, but I thought I'd voice them on behalf of everyone who's said them already, and just manifest out loud what everybody's thinking, which is, thank you very much, Ray. I really appreciate, first of all, your dedication to this task of awakening as many people and minds as you can when you speak about this question with passion and love. And it shows with your equanimity. Actually, you speak of these dire situations, but also with joy. So I think it is possible to address these terrible situations with equanimity and joy, and to perform these actions with that kind of intent to help and to be selfless. And I think this really shows through really beautifully. So thank you so much for offering your time, energy, and resources to this effort.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you to Andre for coming up with the idea of presenting to the Ottawa Sangha or Ottawa groups. And I do want to thank Sharon for the question and answer, and Denise for all the cut and pasting in the Zoom chat. I hope people had an opportunity to actually try the links out. I will make a copy of the presentation available with the links that are in the slide, so I will send that out shortly. And we're so busy with these campaigns right now, and the election comes up on Thursday. So yeah, so I think after that I'll probably be able to do that and send out the presentation. So thanks everyone very much for attending and asking your questions, and I hope you really benefited from it. And I hope I've actually been able to motivate you to actually do something about our climate crisis. So.